Hey, you came back. Thanks, I appreciate that. All right, so concept 4.3, that's our last concept for chapter 4, and I kind of cut this one off because it is heavy on vocabulary, and I wanted to kind of keep it separate just so maybe you could take a break and then come back and have this last part to kind of digest all by itself. Concept 4.3 says a few chemical groups are key to the functioning of biological molecules. And we're going to talk about later on as we go throughout the semester a bit more chemistry and some of these important chemical groups that we're going to talk about. So the properties of organic molecules depends on how these carbon skeletons are laid out, and it depends on what's attached to these carbon skeletons. You have these different types of molecules or groups of molecules that can be attached off of these carbon skeletons. And there's a number of different groups that kind of replace hydrogen. In the most simple of these organic compounds like methane, all you've got is carbon and hydrogen. And those are the easiest ones to talk about and the easiest ones to deal with. But in a lot of organic compounds, there are these groups of atoms, these molecules that attach to the carbon that have a pretty important place in talking about organic chemistry. So what we're going to do is talk about these groups, and they're called functional groups. Functional groups, the definition, or a good way to think about them is they are components of organic molecules, and they are the part that's usually most involved in the various chemical reactions. So there's actually a number of functional groups that we need to take a look at. And the way they're put together gives the molecule its properties. So again, going back to that first idea, I think in chapter 1 or chapter 2 of form and function, the way these molecules are put together has a big effect on how they behave and what they do. So there's actually 7 functional groups that we need to be at least somewhat familiar with. I wouldn't say we have to have all of them memorized to the nth degree, but we are going to refer to them later on, and we are going to talk about a few of them in depth when we talk about different processes that occur in living cells. So we at least need to be somewhat familiar with the names and perhaps what they are. 7 functional groups. The first one is the hydroxyl group, the carbonyl group, the carboxyl group, the amino group, the sulfhydryl group, the phosphate group, and the methyl group. And if you're thinking I could have just rattled all 7 of these off the top of my head without looking, you are incorrect. So I myself had to kind of look back and refresh and have to kind of keep a list. In the textbook, there is a fantastic layout or chart of this on page 64 and 65 of your text. I realize we don't all have textbooks, so I'm going to lay out the chart here, and that way we can kind of talk about each one of these. So first we'll kind of do an overview, and then we'll kind of hit each one to get at least a basic understanding of what these groups are. So these are the 7 functional groups that oftentimes are attached to these carbon chains that make up big, important organic molecules. So just a quick overview of the first ones. Here's the hydroxyl group, carbonyl group, and carboxyl group. And I put this note in here just so you'd have it. But we're going to spend some time and go over each one of these. So this is just kind of your summary. We'll come back to it. And here are the last 4: amino, sulfhydryl, phosphate, and methyl. So let's take a look at each one of these. And then, of course, you have these notes if you needed or wanted to print them out or look at them again. You have them kind of summarized there. So the first one is the hydroxyl group. I like these little charts because they're laid out the same for each one. At the top, it'll have the name of the group, hydroxyl. Then it's going to kind of show you a structure, kind of show you the model of what it looks like. Then it's going to give you an example. Again, it even shows you a different structural diagram down here. It's going to have a name of the compound, like what is sort of their common names, and then what is its properties, what about it makes it unique or different from some of the other functional groups. So the hydroxyl, based on the name, you could probably have guessed it has something to do with hydrogen and oxygen, and that's what it is. It's a OH. It's an oxygen with the hydrogen off of it. So a good example is ethanol, and there it is in the purple. There's your little OH sticking off. That's a functional group. This could have had just a hydrogen stuck off here, and it would have been a different molecule, a different compound. This is ethanol. There's its little hydroxyl group right there. These are commonly referred to as alcohols, so you could think ethanol or methanol, any of those. They usually have OL at the end of their name, and that represents the fact that it has a hydroxyl. Some of their properties, they're polar, so because remember the oxygen tends to pull on that shared electron more, that makes the hydrogen slightly positive, and the oxygen slightly negative. So they're polar, and that means they can form hydrogen bonds with water molecules. That means they can help dissolve organic compounds such as sugars and things like that. So the fact that this OH kind of gives this whole molecule a little bit of polarity on the end means it can readily combine with water and make those hydrogen bonds that we were talking about in the last couple of chapters. The next functional group we're going to look at is called carbonyls. Again, from the name, you can kind of guess it has something to do with oxygen and carbon, and sure enough it does. It's a carbon with a double bond to the oxygen. Here you have a model right here. Down below they give you some examples. Here we have two isomers of the same material. We have acetone and propanol, and you can see if you were to count up the number of hydrogens and carbons and oxygens, you'd see that they have the same chemical formula, but because they're laid out differently, physically they're laid out differently, that would make them isomers. Name of the compounds, they have two different names. If the carbonyl group, if the little C to O group here is within the skeleton, it's called a ketone. So here's a good example of a ketone, where that C to O carbonyl group is in the middle of the structure. That would be a ketone. And if it is not, if the carbonyl group is at the end of the skeleton, like here, this carbonyl group is at the end of the skeleton, that's what we call an aldehyde. So propanol is a good example of an aldehyde. Acetone is a good example of a ketone. These are isomers of each other, structural isomers. They can have different properties. They may not act the same way, even though they have the same chemical formula. Ketones and aldehydes are found within a lot of our sugars, and so the two major groups of sugars are ketoses and aldoses. That tells you whether or not they contain ketones or aldehydes. My gosh, this is too easy, you're saying, right? I mean, if this is all there is, you've got it whipped. Well, let's make it a little bit more difficult. So remember the last two we looked at, we had, for a quick review, we had the hydroxyl, which was an OH, and then we had the carbonyl, or carbonyl, which is a CO. Well, what if we combine those two? Well, that can't happen. We have what we call a carboxyl. A carboxyl is where we have the C double bonded to an oxygen, and the OH as well. So this is actually like a combination of the first two we looked at. It's a combination of the hydroxyl and the carbonyl group. So here we have the hydroxyl with the OH, the carbonyl with the CO. Well, now we have all of them. We have what we call a carboxyl, which is the carbon double bonded to oxygen, and the OH group off to the end there. So a good example of this is acetic acid. Here you see that right here. It's kind of a combination of the two that we've already looked at. These are commonly known as organic acids or carboxylic acids, and some of the functional properties. It does act as an acid, obviously, because of the name there. It can donate those H plus protons that we were talking about, because the covalent bond between oxygen and hydrogen is so polar. So the bond between this oxygen and hydrogen is so strongly polar that oftentimes that little H basically gets left out in the cold, and he disassociates and becomes H plus. So we are adding H plus ions, so that is an acid. Where is this material found? It's in the cells in ionized form with a charge of 1 minus, and it's called carboxylic ion. Carboxylate ion. So we'll talk about some of these more when we start talking about individual cells. So far we have the hydroxyl and the carbonyl. Now kind of the combination of those two is carboxyl. That is also a functional group. Okay, the good news is we're going to move away from carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. The next one is called the amino. The amino functional group, those as a group are called amines or amines, depending on who you ask, and they involve nitrogen. So if we have nitrogen, which is bonded to hydrogen there, that as a group is called an amino functional group. And a good example is glycine. Glycine, you can see on the very end, it has that nitrogen to hydrogen functional group. What are its properties? It actually acts as a base because it can actually pick up H plus ions from the surrounding solution. So here you can see what might happen. That nitrogen can actually pick up an extra hydrogen, and that would be in its ionized form, it would be +1 because it picked up that extra hydrogen. And it's also found in cells. It's with a charge of 1+. So again, this is another one of those functional groups that we're going to talk about later that is very important to cellular chemistry. And this one involves nitrogen. It's called an amino. The next functional group is called the sulfhydryls. The sulfhydryls, again, luckily by their name, you can probably guess what it involves. This one is a sulfur atom bonded to a hydrogen atom. So here you have the SH. That shows you a model. Down here is an example of a cysteine. There's the SH hanging off in the end here. So this would be cysteine. The name of the compounds in general are called thiols. This kind of talks about if you're into hair care or you've ever given yourself a perm. Well, the sulfhydryls were involved in your perm because one of the properties is that two sulfhydryl groups can actually react and form a covalent bond and kind of cross-link. So there can be these linkages between one molecule to another, and that helps stabilize proteins. If you've ever studied human anatomy, you know your hair is made up of keratin, which is a protein-rich material. And so there's a lot of these sulfhydryl cross-linkages going on in your hair. If you want to change your hair from straight to curly, or perhaps straighten your hair from curly to straight, what you do is you use certain chemicals that break these bonds. So if you wanted to give yourself curly hair and you had straight hair, you wrap your hair around curlers or put it in the shape that you want it, and then you douse it with a certain chemical that actually breaks these cross linkages, and then you use a different chemical, or you allow the first one to be rinsed out, and then those cross linkages reform. Now your hair is kind of in the curly shape or the state that you want it. So when those cross linkages reform, they hold the shape of your hair the way that you wanted it. So if you have straight hair, you curl the hair, you add a chemical to break the linkage, add a chemical to rebond the linkage, now you have curly hair. Or you can do the opposite of that. If you have curly hair, and you can straighten it using chemicals to break those linkages, and then reform them in a more straight pattern. Of course, as your new hair grows in, it's not going to follow that same pattern, so your perm tends to grow out, and you have curly ends, but the middle part coming from the scalp is straight because that's what your genetics dictate. So if you want to keep it curly, you got to keep on perming. Our next to the last functional group are the phosphates. Again, luckily because of the name, you can probably guess what it involves. These phosphates involve phosphorus and oxygen. So here you can see the phosphorus, and it's connected to oxygen. It actually has kind of a complicated structure because one of the bonds is a double bond, and then we have individual single covalent bonds with the other oxygen. This actually contributes a negative charge to the molecule that it's attached to. So down here you can see it depends on where it's located as to how much charge, negative charge, it gives whatever molecule it's attached to. But these phosphates turn out to be very important, again, in cellular chemistry. So you'll find that we discuss them again a little bit later on. In general, they're just called organic phosphates. This is a good example of glycerol phosphate. And we'll actually talk about one toward the end here, ATP. Perhaps you've heard of ATP. It's the source of energy for cells, and it is involving these phosphate groups. The last group, my goodness, did I say 7 or 17? Seems like there's been a lot of them. The last group is the methyl functional group. Its structure, the name is not going to help you out there because it doesn't tell you what you need to know. But the methyl functional group is carbon with 3 hydrogens bonded to it, and then that last bond is going to be going to whatever the other part of the molecule is. A major difference between this last group, the methyl group, and all the other groups we've studied is that the other groups that we looked at, they are hydrophilic, so they can be attracted to water in some way, and so that means they can help dissolve some of these organic compounds. The methyl group is not really hydrophilic. It doesn't really help with dissolving in water, and also the methyl group is not really reactive. So the other 6 that we looked at have something to do with the chemical reactivity of the compound or the molecule, but the methyl group really doesn't. The methyl group is kind of more of a marker. It does affect the physical three-dimensional shape of the molecule, but it doesn't really have much to do with the chemical reactivity. A good example down here is this particular chemical formula, this particular compound, which is called 5-methyl cytidine, and you can see the methyl group hanging off of the ring here. We already talked about the fact that carbon can form rings. Here it's forming a ring with nitrogen and then with other materials off the outside of the ring. One of the things that the methyl groups, you can find these in the various sex hormones that kind of determine if you're male or female. So when a baby is first developing, the male and female hormones that are part of that development affect eventually whether the child becomes male or female, and then once you hit puberty, the various changes that occur to you are because of these different hormones. Well, the hormones are actually structurally very much alike as far as their chemical formula, but the location of these methyl groups and the number of these methyl groups affect the shape and function and have a huge outcome on whether or not you're talking about estrogen or testosterone, and that of course affects male and female traits. A good example of this is there's two sex-related hormones. One's called estradiol and one's called testosterone. And if you look at the structure of them, they're very, very similar. The differences are just a few, and those differences include the location of some of these methyl groups that spin off of the carbon rings that make up these hormones. So again, the shape of the molecule can be or is just as important as the actual chemical makeup of the molecule. Last thing we're going to look at is an example of one of these important organic molecules, and it's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Kind of a long name, so generally speaking, we just call it ATP. This is one of those phosphate molecules with that phosphate group, functional group we were talking about, and it's the primary energy storage molecule within the cell, the primary energy transference molecule within the cell. ATP consists of an organic molecule called adenosine, and then it has attached to it 3 of these phosphate groups. So here's a very simplified model. They didn't even go in and show you what makes up the adenosine. But, so we have the adenosine attached with these 3 phosphate groups, and that's where we get that name ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And then as part of the cellular activity, when this gets broken down, it becomes adenosine diphosphate. That would be ADP. When one of these phosphate groups is broken off, that releases an enormous amount of energy. And so when we talk about photosynthesis and cell respiration and some of those different cellular processes, we'll come back to this molecule ATP. And I just want you to remember, this is a good example of where one of these functional groups comes into play. All right, let's wrap it up here. So the chemical element of life, carbon, a quick review. The versatility of carbon makes it possible for there to be a huge variety of organic molecules. And the differences in these molecules is basically what makes the differences in the biology that you see. The fact that there are so many different possibilities in this carbon bonding to make these different molecules. And not only does the chemical formula matter, but the shape, the actual three-dimensional shape and layout of the molecule matters as well. And that leads to this huge diversity you see in living creatures. Everything from single-cell bacteria to blue whales to dogs to oak trees. It all really starts at this molecular level. If you want to see another take on carbon and a good review of some of the chemistry we talked about in the previous chapters, I highly suggest you go see Hank Green at Crash Course Biology. Right here is a link. You can go straight to the YouTube channel with that link, or you can just go to YouTube and look up Crash Course Biology, and you're looking for the one about carbon. I think the name of it is That's Why Carbon is a Tramp. I called it Free Spirit here just to be a bit more politically correct. But Hank talks about why carbon will so easily hook up with other elements. And again, it's because of those 4 valence electrons and the ability to make all those different bonds. So if you want another take on this information and a good review of chemistry before the first test, go to Hank Green Crash Course Biology, take a look there. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon. I think you guys are probably doing well. Most of you have done a good job so far with your assignments that you've turned in. Don't forget we have the quiz number 2 coming up this weekend. and we're going to push ahead to Chapter 5. See you later, guys.